identify or place ourselves and some of the things we've experienced in those. And then the second part of today's workshop will be, we'll turn from looking at failure itself to something that oftentimes is just as damaging, which is the fear of failure and the things that we don't do because we are terrified of messing up, of failing, and we'll kind of take apart some of the dynamics there. So before, or as we get started today, I'd like us to pray together, and an opening prayer. Please read aloud where it says all. Holy One, as we prepare our hearts for this session,
give us your spirit of wisdom.
As we seek to embody your love in our churches and in the world,
give us your spirit of good counsel.
As we seek to be faithful,
give us eyes to see beyond the obvious.
As we gather in this hour, we lift all in need before you. Please feel free to offer your petitions silently or aloud. We pray for those suffering from the heat in Europe and Central Asia. Pray for the families of those who have died.
Your presence in this place, your glory on our face, we're looking to the sun.
You just keep it going, y'all. Okay. We got it. Okay. Can I keep going now? Yes, turn the tree. That was it. Okay, my hero, that man who keeps playing the drum while he's fighting with this tree. Okay, so how about this one? So a different kind of fail in this clip. Here's another worship drummer fail.
On your name, keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace. For I am yours, and you are mine.
Okay.
I thought it was just overlaid over.
So, all right. So, and then finally, thankfully, no one was seriously injured in this one. This is kind of the one that just cringed. We're going to take just a moment. Yeah, let's hope so. Let's take just a moment to see if our drummer is still alive.
Jesus was against the drummer.
Okay. So some funny worship fails to start our morning out. So but I'd like to go further, than that, and let's do some, application to our to our own lives and experiences here. And I know in stories of failure, I'm not going to ask, some of you I'm sure would be comfortable with, with this, but I'm going to pass some sticky notes around the room. And I'd like us to take just a few minutes, grab a sticky note, and get ready to write. And to reflect. So I'd like you to reflect. Think of a moment in your music ministry, in your church ministry, where you failed. Whatever kind of failure, large, small, something that was your fault, maybe something that really wasn't. And then write what happened briefly. So just a very brief, so that I can, because I'll gather these up and read them. So, for instance, messed up song because plant fell on my head. That's forgot words to solo, lashed out at a musician, kind of different kinds of failure here. And then reflect on, how did you feel? Maybe one or two words to sum up how you felt 3 minutes after the moment of failure. Maybe it was, you felt like it was humorous. You were able to laugh at yourself immediately. Maybe you felt deep shame or guilt or... and then think about kind of the long term. How did you feel 3 years after that particular moment of failure, or in the future if it hasn't quite been 3 years ago? So let's take a few moments and reflect on our own failures. Another minute or so to finish this up. Please pass your sticky notes around the rectangle.
Like,
Yeah. Yes, towards me.
yeah.
Thank you. Okay. A couple more coming this way. All right, thank you. Okay, so let's see what we have in the room. So let's see, someone says in a duet for graduation. Ooh, big event there. Completely forgot the second verse and said that I did to the audience. Ouch. 3 minutes, not the best. This person didn't feel the best. And then 3 years later, I'm the only one who even remembers it and have accepted it, by this point. Just a funny story to tell. Yeah, so sometimes with our failures, time heals some of those initial, wounds of embarrassment, absolutely. So this person confronted a disgruntled worship team member between rehearsal and service one Sunday morning. They said, "I should have waited. It cast a cloud over the worship time for me, and I struggled to engage." And this person says, "I learned a lot about timing." Good, learning from some mistakes here. Here's one, the live stream link not working. Say, identify, because I forgot to put the correct one in the email. Whoops. So, yes, how did you feel 3 minutes? Embarrassed. Yep. And then 3 years, probably hasn't been 3 years, at this point, but feeling fine. It happens. Yes, and we have all
Literally
learned
2 weeks ago.
these. Oh, 2 weeks.
3 years hasn't happened yet, but
That's right. No, we have all, there are particular genres of failures that we have all gotten used to, in the COVID-19 era. So, and this, oh, thank you. This person, let's see. Oh my goodness, there are, we have a whole list of failures.
Yeah,
here.
I have a lot.
So that's, okay, played the wrong hymn. Music fell off the stand. Forgot the stand lights for Silent Night on Christmas Eve. Yelled at musician, always feel bad. Ripped clothes sliding off on and off bench. Yeah, okay. Woo. Let's see. So on this one, the choir was getting ready to sing an anthem one Sunday. I hit play on the track and it was the wrong song. So it was, and this person felt, it's embarrassing to have to stop and scroll to find another song. This one, here's another slide related one. The slides will not come up on the screen, so the choir mumbled the whole first verse before the slide came up. This person felt awful. And, how did you feel 3 years after? This is also a learning moment. Learn to prepare better. Yeah. So we've all got these. I think that, there are a number of different kinds of failures that we'll unpack in a minute. But I think some of these, I like having you do this because it's so relatable. I mean, it happens to all of us. So I want to talk a little bit about the good, the bad, and the ugly of failure. And there is, I think, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there's this whole, if you watch TED Talks or watch the business bros, kind of the business gurus, there's a lot out there on failure is good, yay failure, let's fail often and early and all of those kinds of things. Dare to embrace failure, change your metric of success, maybe failure is success. Anyway, so there's a lot out there right now, kind of the pendulum swing towards failure is good. Maybe sometimes. I can think of some failures, though, that are kind of unmitigatedly bad. So how do we make sense out of failure kind of as a category? And I want to draw from, in this talk, when I was trying to figure out how to understand failure, I ran across, highly commend to you, the work of Dr. Amy C. Edmondson. And she is, I would describe her as kind of, Amy Edmondson is to research on failure as Brene Brown is to research on shame. Like she is, and she's a wonderful communicator. I mean, she has lots of academic business books and articles, but then also this short article and something that you can just Google, and find is freely accessible in the Harvard Business Review, Strategies for Learning from Failure. But she divides failure into 3 different kinds that I think is really helpful for parsing these. And the glosses on the side, those are mine, the bad, ugly, and good. But let's talk first about this, about the bad kind of failure, which she describes as as preventable failure. And this is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, right? A failure that you had the knowledge and ability to prevent. Okay, so Hillsong or drummer playing whatever that was in the middle of the oceans, it was completely out of character, and that was a preventable failure, right there. Or the anthem on set, there were a couple of those in the comments, where something didn't go well because you weren't well enough prepared, or you didn't rehearse, something as much as you knew you should have. So preventable failure, this is the kind of failure that feeling bad, feeling some measure of guilt or embarrassment, is perfectly appropriate after a preventable failure and is often necessary. I mean, God designed us with emotions for a reason, and some of these uncomfortable emotions that we get after a preventable failure are, our body's way of just being like, I don't like this. Can we please avoid doing this again so that I don't feel this way? So, preventable failures are, usually due to the result of our or someone's, laziness, entitlement, or, reluctance to follow instructions. And these are the kinds of failures where confession and repentance is the appropriate course of action. So in my tradition, and I would imagine in many others, many of yours, we say the prayer of confession on Sunday mornings. Most merciful God, we confess that we have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed, by what we have done and by what we have left undone. We have not loved you with our whole heart. We have not loved our neighbors as ourselves. So these largely are these preventable failures where we had knowledge and ability to prevent them, but didn't. But there are other kinds of failures. So going to the complex failure, which is just unlike preventable failures, this is just ugly. These can also be understood, Edmondson says, as unavoidable failures, which makes it oftentimes it's difficult to assign responsibility for them. So plant falls on drummer. I mean, whose fault was that? Ultimately, I don't know, Hobby Lobby's for making a lopsided plant. So a complex failure where Edmondson writes that they happen when a particular combination of needs, people, or problems occur that's never occurred before. Can we all think of something recently that has produced
2 years?
this kind of, the last 2 years of global pandemic that none of us have ever, yes, there have been other pandemics, but the world was slightly different back in 1919. And so some of the lessons, granted, we could have learned some lessons, certainly from 100 years ago, but so many other things are different. Air travel, people being able to go from place to place. The fact that there are multiple billions of people in the world. So figuring out what to do in the face of COVID. I imagine we all have complex failure stories of when do we meet in person? How long do we meet online? For how long? When do we stop wearing masks? Should we start wearing masks again? And then complex failures, to say several here, of live streaming. No sound, bad sound, no image, no connection, wrong, link. These kinds of things can be considered, many of them, as complex failures of us trying to deal with a brand new reality that no one has dealt with before. And I should say that these kinds of failures can be mixed. I mean, oftentimes in a complex failure, we can go back and say, okay, there were elements of this that might have been preventable. So you can kind of mix the different kinds. But Edmondson says that complex failure isn't bad in the same way that preventable failure is, because when we notice our failures of this type, we can prevent future mistakes in similar situations that might come up in the future. So we have all learned way more about live streaming, recording technology, mixing voices of a choir that's meeting virtually, and things that may come in handy, again in the future that we've learned from these complex failures. Edmondson's final category is the intellectual failure, which this is the kind, all those business gurus from earlier, this is the kind that is being celebrated as good. And this kind of intellectual failure, which in some ways, I don't like the term, I would prefer, if it were me naming these, I would name it like experimental failure or something. Because intellectual failures occur when experimentation is necessary. And Edmondson says when answers aren't knowable in advance because this exact situation hasn't been encountered and perhaps never will again. So all of us know we face problems in our churches, in our ministries, and we have to come up with, solutions for those, even if we're in uncharted waters. So, some examples of this, she, is in the business world. She says this is when, say, a business does market research, they do their homework, they do like a soft launch of a brand new product, and yet it fails. So they did their homework. It wasn't a preventable failure. It looked like it was going to work, but then for some reason it just didn't. How about this one? I was thinking of, say, my experience in the last 6 months. You try a new song that you think your choir or band is going to learn easily and is really going to like. And then you find that they think it's really hard and they hate it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, okay. And then, or you might attempt a combined music ministry opportunity with a church down the street, and no one shows up, despite your best efforts of getting the word out, publicizing. These are what Edmondson would call intellectual failures. Again, I kind of like, it was an experimental failure that didn't work. And Edmondson says these are the kinds of failures that you should be announcing from the rooftops. She says, in these circumstances, we should tell everybody about our failure, because if we don't discuss intelligent failures, it's likely that other people are going to repeat exactly the same mistakes. Other people that encounter those, similar problems in a changing environment. So Edmondson says that failures in this category, the intellectual failure, can rightly be considered good because they provide valuable new knowledge that can help an organization or church or ministry leap ahead and ensure its further growth. Trial and error is a common term for the kind of experimentation needed in these settings, but she says she thinks this is a misnomer because error implies that there was a right outcome in the first place. Again, these are the frontiers. Nobody knows kind of what the outcome, what is even the right outcome sometimes. At the frontier, the right kind of experimentation produces good failures quickly. Managers or ministers who practice it can avoid unintelligent failures, can avoid preventable failures certainly, but perhaps can even cut off the opportunity for some of the complex failures to emerge. So turning from our typology of failure here, if you're interested in the article, there are even more shades of failure that she talks about, from all the way from blameworthy to praiseworthy failures, which I thought was really interesting. So please go look up her article in the Harvard Business Review. But just briefly, before moving on to our second part, I want to talk about a little bit about what failure is good for. And something that came out on so many of these things that you all filled out is failure is good for learning. When we reflect on, okay, what happened, first off, and maybe we need some perspectives outside ourselves. Maybe we need other people's input on, okay, what was your experience of this, of this failure? Because sometimes, when we get other people's experience, sometimes what we saw as a failure, maybe someone else didn't perceive it in that way. Or vice versa, maybe something we thought was successful, somebody else potentially saw some problems with. Reflection on our failures can lead us into learning and into, avoiding these preventable failures. Another thing, and a surprising thing, I thought you all would appreciate, as leaders, is that failure, or talking openly about your failure, is good for building trust. There is a whole, in a kind of an unrelated research project, I stumbled across this whole really fascinating subfield in the management literature of humor and leadership. So some really fun things about people studying executives cracking jokes or admitting of itself or being self-deprecating. And some management theorists go so far as to say that self-deprecating humor, where we announce, not to the point of undermining our authority, but when a leader gets up and is able to laugh at themselves and their failures, they say that self-deprecating humor has essentially become a requirement for effective leadership in the 21st century. And their study suggests leaders that engage effectively, again, not in the undermining, don't trust me kind of way, effectively in self-deprecating humor about their own faults or weaknesses, are generally perceived by the people they lead as more truthful and thus more trustworthy, and thus ultimately more effective So, and then I think the last point, and the theological point among these, is that our weakness, our failures, oftentimes are powerful demonstrations of God's power. So, of course, picking out the classic picture of, failure, a person who fails often. I'm not going to call him a failure, obviously. A person who often is depicted as failing. In the New Testament, the Apostle Peter, he sinks in the water. He cuts off a guy's ear when Jesus is like, no, not violence. He denies Jesus 3 times. And so arguably, kind of by the account that we have, arguably this guy is the biggest failure in the New Testament. And yet, upon this rock, I will build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I think that promise, or Jesus's building on top of a rock that seems so unsteady, that's riven with cracks and failures. The fact that God can build something on that, I think, is really hopeful for us and for our failures. So, part 2, the fear of failure. And now, for a time of sticky note reflection, once again. So this time, please think of, in the category, the failure category of things left undone. Think of something that you really wanted to try but didn't because you were afraid of failing. Write it on a sticky note and then do the same kind of reflection of how did you feel 3 minutes after making the decision not to do this thing that you were afraid of failing, if you did it, and then how did you feel 3 years or in the future after making the decision not to do it. I'm going to sit down. If you'd like me to, I'm going to sit down now while they write, or do you want me to? Okay.
And it can be on life more generally, like
Mm-hmm.
just things in our life.
Yeah. Cool. Take another minute or so to finish up your sticky note. When you're finished, if you will pass the sticky notes around the table in my direction. So, some things left undone for folks. So someone says, something they really wanted to try but didn't for fear of failure, starting a master's degree in the middle of my career. And they said, still struggling with this one. Didn't try teaching a pretty difficult piece of music because I was afraid the choir wouldn't be faithful enough to be at rehearsals to learn it. Zip lining. I was trying to read the writing here, and I'm just like, oh, okay, yes. Zip lining. So this person says, I've always thought it sounds fun, but yeesh, heights. Okay. So it sounds like they're feeling okay about this decision not to do zip lining. Okay. One person says they regret, being. They wanted to become more forthcoming in a social, professional situation, and that 3 minutes after the fact, I didn't feel much, but 3 years after, that in hindsight, I regretted it. Someone said I wanted to go back into the classroom. After 3 minutes, I was torn because I stayed in parish music ministry, and 3 years after, regret not trying it, to have an opportunity to work with children. So, and then some, thank you. Wanted to organize a community hymn sing, but didn't because of COVID. And 3 minutes after, felt bad. And then hoping to do it this year, because people were asking for it. So that tough decision sometimes to wait. And, and thanks, whoever shared this one, a really personal one, choosing not to pursue fertility treatments. And 3 minutes after, felt sad, but then 3 years after, grateful for my adopted son. So with our fear of failure, I think one very interesting book that I've encountered in the last year that I would strongly commend to each and every person. It is now required reading for our Baylor doctoral students. And it's and I tell them this, I'm just like, this is the most easy and the most fun book you will read throughout your entire program, okay? So don't be, intimidated because doctoral students are reading this. It's such a great, light, funny, but also, really convicting and challenging read. John Acuff's Finish, Give Yourself the Gift of Done. And in this, how this relates to what we're talking about is that he says the biggest enemy of finishing is not failure. Perfectionism that's oftentimes driven by this abject fear of failure is the ultimate villain in the quest to finish. Or oftentimes, as with this question, sometimes even in the attempt, or even to start or to try something. So we're going to spend a little bit of time because, when I was thinking about this session, I'm just like, who's gonna be in here, in this room, interested in learning about failure? Probably all you people like me, recovering perfectionists, who are terrified of it, right? So anyway, so I'm talking to all you, perfectionist, closet or not, in the room right now. So what is perfectionism? It's the tendency to demand of others or of oneself an extremely high or even flawless level of performance in excess of what is actually required by the situation. And why it's in the APA Dictionary of Psychology is that perfectionism is associated with depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and other mental health problems. So one thing, and I know we use this term a lot in kind of everyday language. It's become kind of something that we joke about, but its root. I found this quote, and it made me think of another quote, which is like, our tradition has something to say about this. Michael Law says, at its root, perfectionism isn't really about a deep love of being meticulous. It's about fear. Fear of failure, of making a mistake. Fear of disappointing others. Fear of failure, and sometimes bizarrely, fear of success. Because if this happens, then what bar am I going to have to reach? And I'd like us to read this together. I read that quote, and I thought immediately of the verse in 1 John. So please read with me. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. So Acuff, in the beginning of his Finnish book, he talks about, lest there's anyone reading the book, and he responds to common objections like, but if I weren't a perfectionist, I wouldn't have accomplished everything that I did, or I wouldn't have any drive or motivation were it not this fear of failure. And so he tries to convince you in the very beginning. He's like, no, here's why this is a really bad thing. So why is perfectionism so dangerous? The first thing he talks about is that it masquerades as excellence. So the thing about excellence is it doesn't look like this. Excellence, you notice that they're going in the same direction, long obedience in the same direction, right? But there are these, these are the moments of failure in there, whether that's preventable, or complex, or intellectual. Excellence is this journey, but perfectionism, makes you think that its way is the way to excellence. It convinces you, appropriate for our session, that its opposite is failure. And I don't know how many of you, just raise of hands, how many of you in school or as children grew up with practice makes perfect? Practice makes perfect, yes. I love, so my girls who are 5 and 6 are coming home from school now with, instead of practice makes perfect, practice makes progress. I'm like, that is so much more healthy. That is, practice makes progress, not setting them up for this experience of failure, but a recognition that that's part of the process. Oftentimes, perfectionism magnifies your mistakes and minimizes your progress. So I imagine all of us have been in this situation of, on a Sunday morning, 99% of everything goes great, but it's that 1% that is all we can think about after the service, that keeps us up at night, that we spend an inordinate amount of time the next week, trying to fix without celebrating all of the good things. A few other things. Why is perfectionism so dangerous? Again, this abject fear of failure that leads to inaction on our parts. One of them is it rejects the better, insisting on the best. And I found many cultures around the world have a saying very similar to this one. The perfect is the enemy of the good. The perfect, if we're aiming for perfect, a lot of times we don't even start. Or if we fall off the horse one time, we don't get back on. Perfectionism, and this was one that I hadn't thought about until Acuff brings it out. Perfectionism seeks to isolate you. So a lot of times he says it's easier to get you to believe lies and follow secret rules when you don't have a community telling you the truth and calling you out on it. And so a lot of times, I think this is a poignant image of how it feels when we're trapped in this fear of failure. And then, again, being trapped, it traps you in a self-perpetuating cycle of guilt, frustration, regret, and shame that can be really hard to get out of. So Acuff, in this book, I'm going to tell you some of he calls out are the lies of perfectionism, the lies and the strategies that so many of them, and if you're like me, I'm just like, I see myself in every chapter, of this, sometimes some more than others, but see what resonates most with you out of these. There are 4 lies and then 3 strategies. So if it can't get you to believe these lies, think, angel demon on your shoulder, the little guy over here, perfectionism, no mistakes. If he can't get you to believe those lies, then there are some distractions in just a minute. So the 4 lies of perfectionism. The number one is that you should quit if it isn't perfect or if it can't be perfect. Just don't even try. The second one, your goal should be bigger. And this is a really interesting one, and Acuff provides an antidote to each of these in the chapters of the book. And this has been the single most helpful one in my own life, like academically and ministry-wise, is that instead of making your goal bigger, he says, take your goal, take what you want to do and what you're not doing because you're afraid of failing, and cut it in half. So you want your choir to learn 8 new anthems this fall, make it 4. Or you want to, or if you think that it's going to take you 2 hours to do something, he said, for things that you can't really break up like that, then double the time. So you think it's going to take you 2 hours to do something, build in